Welcome back to Andersen Acres. Today we are going to make a rye sourdough, and we're actually going to shape those rolls, that dough, into sub buns. So you can do a lot of different things with sourdough. It's very, very versatile. So we're just going to show you one other thing to do with sourdough. So to get started, we have to remember that we are not adding any yeast to this because we have our sourdough starter. So we're going to want to give our sourdough starter a little mix. Always mix it before you measure it because you want to make sure that there's a film on top that is a normal film. You want that film, but you want to mix it in. You don't want a scoop of just that film. So give that a good stir down. Scrape down your scraper because you want to get as much of that starter back into your jar as possible. Yes, you do. So scrape that starter down as much as you can. There we are. Very nice. Just put that in the sink. Now we need half a cup of starter into our bread pan. We are going to use our bread maker today just because it's not occupied by doing anything else, so I don't have to do this by hand. But you can do it by hand if you like. But we're using the bread maker today. So you need half a cup of this starter. To get half a cup of this starter, I'm using a 1/4 cup scoop just because it fits in my jar better. But if you have a jar that fits a 1/2 cup scoop, then you're good. So I have to do 2 nice healthy scoops. Don't skimp. This is what causes your bread to rise because we're not using any yeast. So we do want 2 nice big healthy scoops. There we go. Put that to the side. 2 nice big healthy scoops. Okay, stick that in the sink. That's because you don't want to drip sourdough starter all over your counters and floors. It's not fun. Now you want 1 tablespoon of sugar. Sprinkle that over the starter gently because that helps feed the starter again. Just gets it started. So sprinkle that on. Now we want 1 cup of slightly warm water. So you don't want it cold enough to kill the yeast, but you also do not want it warm enough that it starts to activate the yeast too quickly because there is yeast in that starter. It is already fermented. It just needs to be woken up a bit. Next, you want about 2 tablespoons of butter. You can use margarine if you like. I just happen to be using butter right now. But you can do this with margarine. You won't really notice the difference. Now you want 2 cups of white or all-purpose flour. You can use a bread flour if you like. In sourdoughs, because they take so long, it doesn't really matter if you use a bread flour or an all-purpose. Then you want 1 cup of rye flour. Okay, just 1 cup. On top of the flour, because we're using a bread pan, we want to put our 1 teaspoon of salt. Now we are not putting any yeast whatsoever in this particular bread. We don't have to because we have the starter on the bottom. So we're just going to pop this in our bread maker, and we have to ignore it for about 8 hours, maybe 10 hours, because rye flour does cause it to rise much more slowly. So put this in your bread maker or do it by hand, but either way you're going to be waiting about 8 hours at least, maybe 10. So we'll come back in 8 to 10 hours and see how that dough is doing. All right, so our rye sourdough has been rising for 8 hours. It wasn't as bad as it could have been. Sometimes rye doughs take a very long time, and so only 8 hours for a sourdough is not horrible. So it has doubled in size. It is as big as it's supposed to be. So we're just going to pry that out of there. It will be a little sticky because it is a sourdough. So we're just going to make sure we got all the dough. Sometimes when you have a stickier dough, some of the dough wraps around the kneading blade in your bread maker. So you just have to pull the kneading blade out and get that dough. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take this dough, make it into a ball, and we're going to divide it into 4 because, like I said earlier, we are going to make buns for submarine sandwiches. That's a horrible divide. That was horrible. One was very, very small, so we're going to do that again. It's okay. It's dough. You can always do it again. All right. Much better. There we go. And divide each of these into 2. Roughly equal. You don't have to be perfect, but you do have to be roughly equal. Okay. So this dough is actually feeling really good. Yeah, it's sticking to my hands. That's really normal with any sourdough. So we're just going to do this, make these into balls. Look, one more. 4. This we can set aside. We don't need that anymore. I used this guy when I did the sub buns using just regular white bread. Today we're going to do a rye sourdough, apologies. And we're just going to roll these out. Yeah, that happens with a sticky dough. You just put it back down. So we're just going to roll these out. Roll up your sleeves because your sleeves will get caught in this dough because it's wet. So start by just pulling it because it's a wetter dough. Pull it. Because rolling it like this a lot is not going to help you because see how much it sticks when you do that? So don't do that because this is quite a wet dough. So what you want to do is you want to get it roughly equal and roughly the same length as your mold, and then you're just going to move them. They're not going to be perfect because it's sourdough, and sourdough can get pretty weird. So you're just going to set them in their molds. It's not going to be perfect. Remember, you are going to let these rise for a long time, so don't worry about it too much. They'll rise up, they'll have a nice looking top. Even if the top doesn't look nice when you start, they'll still look nice later on. Okay, so we're just going to do that again. Go like this, because if I go like this, see, it just sticks. There's no point in doing that. So we just do that. Try to make it as even as you can. Kind of play with it in the pan. Remember, it's a sourdough, so this isn't going to work very well. I mean, you can add a little more flour, but you're not supposed to. It kind of ruins the whole point of sourdough. If you add extra flour, it gets kind of tough. So you could, but really what you should do is just deal with it. So you just deal with it by playing with it, getting it pushed down. Now, yes, this has 5 cavities. We are not going to have enough dough with this amount of sourdough to make 5. So we're only making 4. We're only making 4 of these. So we just lay them in here. Then we're going to set it aside to rise. Remember that this is sourdough. It's going to take a long time to rise. So we're going to have to wait 2 to 4 hours, closer to the 4-hour mark, because it is rye. So we will come back in 3 to 4 hours to see how they're doing and decide if they're ready to bake. All right, so our rye sourdough buns are just about ready to go into the oven. They're going to go into the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for about 30 to 35 minutes. Not the full 40 minutes. We would often do sourdough just because they're skinnier and we don't want them to get too overcooked. Now, I'm just going to take a moment to slash about 5 slashes each in each of these. Always good to slash your sourdough anyway, but because these are kind of a sub bun, I want them slashed just so that they look pretty and they'll make excellent sandwich buns. Okay, so we're going to shove them in the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for about 30 to 35 minutes. We'll be back. All right, so there are our finished rye sourdough buns. These ones are in the shape of a sub bun so that you can make sandwiches with them. You can, of course, do them any shape. You can also do a larger loaf like we've done in previous videos. Either way, they are delicious and a lot of fun to make. They do take a lot of time. So the very first rise where they were sitting in the bread maker was about 10 hours. The second rise was about 3 hours. So it took a while. All right, it takes about a good 12 hours to make this, and that's not counting making your starter. There is a link in the description to how to make that starter initially, because I didn't do that in this video. I'm not going to show it more than once, so I'll just link back to the initial video. Otherwise, that's exactly how you make a rye sourdough. It's simple and fun. So I hope you enjoyed making that with us today. Hopefully we will see you tomorrow.